Iran is not Iceland, Ron. Iran is a country that has been at war with us since 1979.
For most Americans, the story begins in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis.
Iran is a country that has killed more American men and women in uniform in Iraq and Afghanistan than the Iraqis and the Afghanistans have.
The senator is wrong on his history. We've been at war in Iran for a lot longer than '79. We started it in 1953 when we sent in a coup, installed the Shah, and the reaction, the blowback came in 1979. It's been going on and on because we just plain don't mind our own business. That's our problem.
But to really understand, we have to go back to 1953, which is where the story begins for most Iranians. This was the year that the U.S. overthrew Iran's democracy and installed the Shah, a pro-U.S. dictator. As a test of fairness, we might imagine that Iran invaded and occupied Canada and Mexico and had aircraft carriers sitting in the Caribbean. Imagine then if Iran had the power to label the U.S. the axis of evil and cut us off from the rest of the world, and then threaten to attack us if we didn't stop generating nuclear power. What if Iran had overthrown the U.S. government 50 years ago and installed a dictator friendly to Iranian interests, who kept it in power for 25 years? At that point, imagine that Christian fundamentalists, who currently represent about a third of the U.S., took power and began ruling under church law, followed by an unprovoked invasion by Canada, supported by Iran and ignored by the UN, in which it nearly destroyed the US. Would it be possible to imagine Iran as liberators? Would Iran be justified in attacking if the US government helped Christian fundamentalists in Canada to take up resistance?
We're going to find out massive evidence of weapons of mass destruction, massive evidence of weapons of mass destruction.
All those things that you predict are going to come true, and a lot of people that have been laying out the case against us are going to be very embarrassed.
Intelligence gathered by this and other governments leaves no doubt that the Iraqi regime continues to possess and conceal some of the most lethal weapons ever devised.
Iraq provided training in these weapons to Al-Qaeda.
Listen, these folks are determined. These are killers. They chop people's heads off. They're getting money from around the world. They're getting recruits.
It turned out, as we discovered later, that a lot of the sourcing that had been attested to by the intelligence community was wrong. I deeply regret that the information I presented with the multi-source was wrong.
We thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't. Those weapons of mass destruction got to be somewhere.
18 people were killed in Iraq.
Nope, no weapons over there.
As many as 4 people are dead and 15 wounded after a car bomb exploded on Tuesday.
Maybe under here.
Very embarrassed.
In light of the fact that we did not find the weapons of mass destruction, would you do the same thing all over again? Would you do the same thing all over again?
We rested our case on the existence of weapons of mass destruction. I think without that weapons of mass destruction case, the justification would not have been there.
It has nothing to do with national security. Matter of fact, our national security is more jeopardized by permitting this to happen because we're liable to start a war. We're liable to have our military men killed. We're liable to have more attacks on us by terrorists.
I do not think it's effective. I think it drums up more anti-American hostility.
I see no threat to our national security. There's no convincing evidence that Iraq is capable of threatening the security of this country. Very little reason, if any, to pursue a war.
The Iranians have repeatedly said they want to wipe Israel off the map.
Take military action to keep Iran from having a nuclear weapon.
You have to take whatever steps are necessary to break its capacity to have a nuclear weapon.
The Iranians are the existential threat to the state of Israel.
Without a shadow of a doubt,
leaves no doubt,
Iran will take a nuclear weapon. They will use it to wipe our ally Israel off the face of the map.
It's another Iraq coming. There's war propaganda going on. To me, the greatest danger is that we will have a president that will overreact.
Washington's enemy is an enemy that doesn't exist.
This wild goal to have another war in the name of defense is the dangerous thing.
But there is nothing that indicates that Iran is really building a bomb.
They produced information that led you to believe that, but they have no evidence.
We might not be able to trust the IAEA. They say that the source is actually a single source.
The sourcing was wrong.
Will not tell us where that source is coming from at all. The provenance of that source has not been established.
Just like we did in Iraq, build up the war propaganda. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq.
Okay.
It's time we quit this.
Imagine for a moment that somewhere in the middle of Texas there was a large foreign military base, say Chinese or Russian. Imagine that thousands of armed foreign troops were constantly patrolling American streets in military vehicles. Imagine they were here under the auspices of keeping us safe, or promoting democracy, or protecting their strategic interests. Imagine that they operated outside of U.S. law and that the Constitution did not apply to them. Imagine that every now and then they made mistakes or acted on bad information and accidentally killed or terrorized innocent Americans, including women and children, most of the time with little or no repercussions or consequences. Imagine that they set up checkpoints on our soil and routinely searched and ransacked entire neighborhoods of homes. Imagine if Americans were fearful of these foreign troops and overwhelmingly thought America would be better off without their presence. Imagine if some Americans were so angry about them being in Texas that they actually joined together to fight them off in defense of our soil and sovereignty because leadership in government refused or were unable to do so. Imagine that those Americans were labeled terrorists or insurgents for their defensive actions and routinely killed or captured or tortured by the foreign troops on our land. Imagine that the occupiers' attitude was that if they just killed enough Americans, the resistance would stop, but instead, for every American killed, 10 more would take up arms against them, resulting in perpetual bloodshed. Imagine if most of the citizens of the foreign land also wanted these troops to return home. Imagine if they elected a leader who promised to bring them home and put an end to this horror. Imagine if that leader changed his mind once he took office. The reality is that our military presence on foreign soil is as offensive to the people that live there as armed Chinese troops would be if they were stationed in Texas. Shutting down military bases
and ceasing to deal with other nations with threats and violence is not isolationism. It is the opposite. Opening ourselves up to friendship, honest trade, and diplomacy is the foreign policy of peace and prosperity. It is the only foreign policy that will not bankrupt us in the short order, as our current actions most definitely will. I share the disappointment of the American people in the foreign policy rhetoric coming from the administration. The sad thing is, our foreign policy will change eventually, as Rome's did, when all budgetary and monetary tricks to fund it are exhausted.